Chapter 13, The Craft Media. Learning objectives. Characterize the difference between craft and fine art. My teacher, when I asked him what the difference between craft and art was, he said, about $30,000. Today, people are accepting craft as art more than they used to, but craft aligned itself with function, whereas art is purely expressive. Like in the fine arts, painting it brought itself up to fine art through working with poetry and doing paintings about poetry. So even painting at one time wasn't considered a fine art. There was recently a show called Poetry of the Physical, and it was a show in Louisville. They were taking crafts, and if you look at the title, they were comparing it with poetry. So the same idea of trying to elevate craft through association with poetry is still happening today. Describe the different ceramic methods and materials. There's a lot of different ways you can work with clay. There are hundreds of thousands of different ways to surface it. You can coat a ceramic piece with gold. You can create a bronze look. You can make it look like metal. You can make shiny glass-like glazes or matte stone-like surfaces. Just all kinds of ways to work with ceramic material, all kinds of different processes. And we'll look at some ancient processes as well as some modern processes. Outline some of the ways in which glass has become an artistic medium. Describe some of the different uses of fiber in the arts. Explain why gold has been a favored material since ancient times. Well, gold is one of the very few that doesn't oxidize. Silver does. Silver tarnishes. Rust takes over steel, unless it's stainless steel, and even it can decay over time outside. Gold is associated with the sun, and it's also been used for a monetary system, for money, and it has a perceived value. We used to back our dollar with gold. We stopped doing that. Gold has been associated with oil, the petrodollar. Now they say data is the new oil. Describe the uses and limitations of wood as an art material. Wood, if you put it outside, it's going to be exposed to the sun, the elements, and the ultraviolet light will turn the wood different color. Cherry wood will darken over time, but it also absorbs water. And as the wood heats up and absorbs water, it expands and then it contracts. It changes its size, and that is conducive to cracking. Some woods rot fairly easily. That's why we have treated lumber, so it doesn't decay quite as fast. But there are some woods like cedar and oak that repel bugs and last a lot longer. Craft media are distinguished from fine arts because they make functional objects. That's where craft began. Making pottery, it was existential. It was rooted in our lives, in function. So it's not really known how the first piece of ceramic was made, but they believe that someone needed a container for something and was standing on some clay-like soil. When they built their fire on top of that, it hardened from the temperature. When you harden clay, it removes the chemical water in it, and the particles of the clay slightly melt and fuse together. When clay is porous, there is not a lot of that fusing. We call it vitrification. Some clays, even like a white earthenware clay, it's still about 10 to 20% porous, so it doesn't have complete vitrification. And the problem with that is that water will store in a little bit of that porosity, and when you put those in your cabinets, mold is going to be attracted to that. Another problem is if you put a porous mug that has water in the clay, when it heats up in a microwave oven, it can cause it to explode because the steam gets trapped in the clay and is trying to force its way out, and that builds up tension and can break the mug or explode. The large-scale installation The event of a thread consists of white silk cloth hanging on an interconnected suspension system. As audience members swing on swings, the silk responds. This is a really interesting work by Anne Hamilton. It's gorgeous. You can YouTube it and see a video feed of it. See, those swings are in the front there. Kids get on those swings. They swing back and forth. There's a cable system and pulley system that pulls that thread, that silk fabric up and down, and it becomes very ethereal, like it's very like spirits floating in the air. It undulates back and forth and creates different shapes. Part of this experience is you get a little bag that you come in with, and inside of it has a little voice box like tape recorder, and there's poetry being read. So you can lay down on the floor and watch this thing moving back and forth and listen to poetry. And so she's linking this idea of the thread, a thread of poetry, and the thread of the textile in this very sculptural event, the event of a thread. The crafts as fine art. If a work is primarily meant to be used, it may be classified as craft. Conversely, if it is mainly meant to be experienced or seen, it may be classified as art. So I think the more you think about that, that just doesn't seem right to have that kind of distinction, because things that are functional, they can be just as expressive as art. And when you think about the technical ability required to make a clay sculpture and apply glaze and fire it 2 times, the science involved, as opposed to someone who is squirting a tube of a plastic color on brushing on a canvas, what it's really based on is the ideas and the beauty that's being expressed in a work of art. We're going to look at Josiah Wedgwood. The piece on the left is from Josiah Wedgwood. He was a potter who really admired the work of the Greeks. In the British Museum in London, he knew that this calyx vase, this Greek vase on the right, was housed there. When he made this piece on the left, he was appropriating some of the styles of the Greek. He titled it his Pegasus piece. We see the handles, the calyx handles on both pieces, and he fashioned the Medusa just under the handles on his Wedgwood piece. He donated to the museum as a way of drawing attention to his work, putting it next to a Greek vase. He felt like it would elevate his work to the importance of the Greek vase. The piece on the left is unglazed. It is stained and then fired, so it's an unglazed piece. The Greek vase is called blackware, and it is an earthenware. It's a low temperature piece. It has been painted with black stone that has been pulverized. One of the things I wanted to mention about Greek pottery, it's where we get the word sincerely. When you finish a letter, you say sincerely. And sincere means it's without wax, because potters in the Greek time period would sometimes, if a pot cracked, they would fill it with wax. When a person was purchasing that piece, they wouldn't be able to recognize that wax would fill that and camouflage the crack. That's where that word came from. Sincere means without wax. This is a calyx flower, and that is where it got its name. We see the sculptural quality of this flower and those petals coming up around those outer leaves. Wedgwood created both ornamental ware and useful ware. The latter was able to be manufactured quickly and efficiently. It also established the artist's reputation and supported his business. The ornamental ware was almost always decorated with low relief Greek figures to authorize it as art. That comparison, if I make it like the Greeks, it will elevate my artwork. A lot of times when a small business, pottery, gets started, they need to make things that are low cost, that will support their artistic careers in the studio. And so Josiah Wedgwood made these inexpensive dinner collection. Calls it the Queen's Ware. So again, he's trying to sell it and associate it with this would be like the Queen's Ware for dinner service. That's good marketing there by Josiah Wedgwood. Another very, very famous pottery in the United States in the late 1800s and 1900s was Rookwood pottery. You can buy a little Rookwood piece for a couple $100 and it can resell for thousands of dollars. So if you ever see the Rookwood logo on a piece, you want to collect that. They are still making Rookwood pieces today. The company has changed hands over time. They still use the same Rookwood symbol, logo. So you have to be knowledgeable enough to know that you're not getting a contemporary piece that's being sold as an antique. There's a potter out in Colorado. I have one of his pieces. He was a Rookwood artist. His name was Van Briggle. He kind of separated from Rookwood and started making his own pottery. His work is highly collectible, and he was one of the first American artists that worked with a stony matte-like glaze. Often his glazes were a medium green with a little bit of a blue kind of airbrushed over top of that. His work involves forms that are derived from nature, as in this piece we see it's a very floral. Sometimes his work is all about leaves in relief. Ceramic objects are either flat or hollow. When you're working with pottery, you want to keep the thickness under a ½ inch. When you go beyond 3/4 of an inch, it is really prone to cracking and exploding or spalling, chipping off pieces. Usually it's about the trapping of moisture in the surface of the clay. Water boils between 200 and 210 degrees. And if there's water moisture inside the clay and it starts boiling, it'll blow up like popcorn. It'll shoot pieces all over the kiln, and chunks can fly across and take out other pieces along the way. So we want to keep the clay relatively thin. Now, you can add things to clay if you want to make it thicker. You can add things that will burn out. So if I wanted to wedge in a little sawdust, some people will wedge in paper fragments because those will burn out in the firing. It lightens the weight of the piece, and the fiber cellulose strands will actually add strength to it to keep it from cracking. Clay expands and contracts. There is time periods where you want to go real slow in the firing. We call that quartz inversion. It's between 900 and 1100 degrees. And in this time period, it's losing chemical water, so it's shrinking, but it's also expanding from the heat. A lot of tension, a lot of force. Really large pieces that are bigger than 2 feet, you want to go very slow through quartz inversion. And typically we fire big pieces for at least 2 days. Extremely large pieces, they fire sometimes for 2 weeks, and they'll have like a week cool down. So an artist like Jun Kaneko, who makes pieces bigger than me, they need to be fired very slowly. Pieces can be created through slab construction, coiling, or being thrown on a potter's wheel. Pieces are then painted with glazing, which both protects them from the growth of bacteria and it produces color. So part of it is sealing the ceramic so it doesn't absorb water, food particles, because those kind of food particles can turn into bacteria and give you a sick stomach from eating off of them. Slab construction. In this method, clay is rolled flat like pie crust and shaped by hand. Tea bowls, such as the one pictured by Koetsu, were highly prized in Japan, particularly for their uniqueness and ability to fit in the hand. So when you hold the tea bowl, you embrace it with both hands, and you want a form that feels nice in the hands. So all of that goes into the making of a tea bowl. Tea is a service where you contemplate, you identify with beauty and the ritual of ceremony and form. You wipe the tea bowl and you fold the napkin, put it away. Over time, it's really become like a dance of form and practice in this process of drinking green tea. It's very unique. I think what's interesting about it, it's like celebrating thankfulness. And we have Thanksgiving in our country, so I see parallels. It possesses the desirable effect of koji, or accidental coloring, that occurs when firing oxidizes natural glass glaze. This is a tea bowl, ketsu. This is titled raku. In this raku process, they prized a oxidation. Oxidation is where air comes into a kiln. When you're firing with wood, you can throw the kiln in reduction, which means it's burning out all the oxygen, and it reduces the clay and turns it dark. But in this process, they revered this flash where oxygen came in and it changed the color of the clay. In Japanese aesthetics and pottery, they embrace the accidental and the imperfection. So oftentimes, like in a Shino glaze, a Chinese or a Japanese Shino glaze, you see little pits. And we in the West would think that that is a flaw, but they embraced it. They would call it a bird's nest. So it sounds much more poetic. But they believed that the imperfection reflected our humanity. Nobody's perfect, and that in the contemplation, in the tea ceremony, this idea of the contemplation of beauty, beauty had a place in it with imperfection. So we think about how imperfection can change character. Marilyn Monroe was a very famous pop icon. She had a mole on her cheek. That imperfection gave her character, quality, and a beauty that she wouldn't have had without that imperfection. So when I explain this idea of humbleness and imperfection, I always think of Marilyn Monroe. This is the tea ceremony, and you have these traditional objects for the tea service, and she's wearing a kimono, a traditional outfit for tea. This is a contemporary tea bowl. It is fired in a wood firing kiln, which we call an anagama. The anagama is a single chamber kiln, and oftentimes they would be run by a family and neighbors, a little community of people that would fire this kiln. These things would be fired for a couple weeks. Oftentimes they went up a side of a mountain, so it would take thousands of pots to fill up that kiln. And it would take a community of potters working together to fire it. Generally, you work in shifts, 4 hours or 8 hours, and then you would rest because it's physically draining to be working really hard at those high temperatures. The wood, as it burns, will create fly ash, and as you rake those coals and stir it, it sends fly ash over the top of the kiln, and it settles down on the pottery. It's high in feldspar, and at about 2300 degrees, that starts to melt, and it becomes a glaze. Wood ash was essentially the beginning of this idea of coating it with a glaze, because in the wood firing, it created its own surface. This is a famous bowl by Shoji Hamada, and Hamada is one of the most revered Japanese potters. He traveled to the United States and met with Bernard Leach and Peter Volkos, Rudiadio. He greatly influenced our appreciation of pottery. We have two traditions. We get one tradition from England, so we have China clay, and like the work that we looked at by Wedgwood, and we have work like this with the Eastern tradition. We're the melting pot in pottery too. But look at the beautiful, spontaneous, brush-like patterns. Very simple, a little dance of contrast of different textures and color. Usually, this brushwork has thick to thin lines and a simplicity and a spontaneity that makes the piece just right. This is Hamada working at the wheel, and they have a different pottery wheel style. You notice he's kind of sitting there in a meditative position with his legs crossed, and he's throwing on a wheel. So he's level with that wheel, where our wheel, we sit in a chair, very different style, and he's throwing off the hump. So that ball of clay, he can throw many pieces off of that one ball of clay and slice them off and throw another one. It's a method for working to produce a lot of pieces very quickly. These are the different ways of throwing on the wheel. So we see Hamada demonstrating this. He has a little stick and he's spinning his wheel around. There are different kinds of pottery wheel. You have treadle wheels that you can kick with your foot. You can have a big concrete flywheel at the bottom and just push it with your foot. And this is a stick method where you take a stick and you get that wheel going really fast, and then you can throw. The weight of the flywheel will keep that wheel spinning, even with a little bit of torque and hand pressure on the piece of clay. When you're centering, you get the wheel going really fast. You want that clay spinning really fast, and then you squeeze it from both sides, and you try and center the clay. You know when the piece is centered, when it's moving really fast, but it looks like it's sitting still. So they call that movement and non-movement. I think that's a really interesting idea. It's moving, but it looks like it's sitting still. So you do that generally by pulling the clay up into a cone and then pushing it back down. In picture 3, we see him opening the form. So you want to drive your thumbs down through the very center of the clay and open it up, make a nice flat base on the bottom, and then you reach in with both hands and you squeeze the clay. You're trapping the clay between the pressure from the inside and pressure from the outside. Now the clay can't move down on the wheel because the wheel will block it, so it has to move up. And so you pull that clay up and you see the throwing lines, like the lines of a tree. You can count those throwing lines, and you can see how many times the pot revolved on that wheel. Generally, after you make your cylinder, you start to shape it, and you can do that by closing the form in, by squeezing it. You can reach inside and bellow it out. You can expand it. We anthropomorphize pottery by saying it has a foot. The foot is what it sits on. It has a body to it. It has a belly. It has a shoulder. And then it has a neck. And then it has a lip. It's interesting that pottery, we understand pottery by comparing it to the anatomy of a person. It has kind of a body language. So when a pot is leaning a certain way, it becomes like body language. It's very expressive. The volume, the proportions, the ratios, the scale, all that is a way of expressing that feeling that a pot can give you, the body language that it has. So after we let it set up, there are different stages in clay. There's wet clay. We throw on the wheel with wet clay. And then as it dries, that water is leaving it and it becomes leather hard. Leather hard is when you can still make impressions in the clay, but it's not soppy, it's not gooey, it's not extremely wet. So it gets to a stage where you can handle it, pick it up without distorting the clay. You can stamp it, you can trim it. We'll see that he's going to turn this upside down and trim it. After it gets past the dryness of leather hard, it goes into, when it's fully dry, it's called greenware. So we let a piece of work get to greenware before we fire it in its first firing, called a bisque. Okay, when it comes out of the kiln, that's bisque. And that is a kind of a dry pink-like color. And it's still very fragile, but it's strong enough to absorb glaze. As we glaze it, it's going to be like a sponge. The glaze is just suspended material. You know, there's oxides, there's silica, feldspar, there's clay, which has alumina in it. And so you're suspending these chemicals, these powders, in water. And as that bisque clay absorbs the water in that glaze, it pulls the glaze to the surface and it clings to it long enough to put that in a kiln and fire it one more time. So we have wet clay, we have leather hard, we have greenware, we have bisque, and then we have high fire. So those are the stages of clay. So after you throw the piece and it's become leather hard and you want to trim the excess off of it and maybe shape it a little bit better and trim that foot on the base of it, you generally put it in a chuck and turn it upside down, put it back on the wheel, center it again, and then you can take a metal tool, a loop tool, and if you turn that tool to the right angle, it's like wood on a lathe, cutting, trimming. It's like lathing that clay in that chuck. Little slivers of clay will fly off when you get that perfect angle of cutting on that form. So clay is a really interesting material to work with. One of the advantages of clay is it's very inexpensive. You can get clay for about between 35 cents and 50 cents a pound. When you're working in gold and silver, it's very different. You have to be very careful not to waste material. But with clay, it's inexpensive and you can recycle the clay that you trim off. You can wet it back down and wedge it back up and use it again. It's really a great material. It's in the metaphor of working with the earth, that meaning. Every piece of pottery is a piece of the earth that's been fired, it's been transformed, and it's very expressive. It has a lot of content, a lot of meaning. This is a multi-chambered anagama, sometimes called a noboragama, and you can see it's moving up the hill. This is Hamada's kiln, his wood kiln, and you can see all the different doors where they load the pots in for firing. After you get all those pots stacked in the kiln on furniture, on kiln shelves and stilts, then you brick up the door. Generally, it takes a couple hours to brick up that door. So you can imagine all the work and attention, all the care of making these pieces and loading in there very carefully and then bricking up the door. You have a lot of work invested in each firing. So a lot of care goes into the firing. And this is a very famous Hamada piece. Again, we see a floral kind of decoration in the glazing part of the process. You can have a big bucket of glaze or barrel size of glaze, and you stir it up really good to suspend all those particles of material. They like to sink to the bottom, and you have to suspend those, so you got to stir for quite a while. You don't want any lumps to get in there. It can make the surface really lumpy. So you stir it up really good, and you can dip the whole thing in there and count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then pull it out and pour out the excess from the inside. The longer you stay in the glaze, the more the glaze will be pulled to the surface and the thicker the glaze becomes. If it is too thick, when it melts, it can run down. Gravity's pulling the glaze and it'll run right off of the pot. And if it attaches to that kiln shelf, it can cause the piece to crack, and you'll have to remove it with a hammer and chisel to get that off the piece. So timing is everything in pottery. Again, we see a kind of a milky white like glaze and a lot of brushwork here. Look at the fluidity in the glaze application. Look at the brush marks. We see a dance of rhythm of different thicknesses, the width of the glaze line, the brushwork. We see a beautiful rhythm and repetition of that shape happening over and over again, moving across the piece. And it is in between two bands. You can apply glaze with the piece on the potter wheel. You can just put that piece on there and spin it really slowly and dip your brush in glaze and make banded lines. So we see lines moving this way, and that creates a sense of meter in the piece. You have the foot line, and then above that we have another line, and then another line, and then in the banding we see that line again, but we move up. So that creates kind of like a meter, like a beat, a visual beat in the work as it moves up. and the last line is the edge of the lip at the top. And the lip is kind of like the invitation into the interior. So generally there's a little swelling of volume in that, and it kind of mimics our lip right here. In a functional piece, you want that lip to be able to flow, the liquid to be able to flow out of that lip without dribbling. Now, this is a very famous group of people here. On the right, we see Hamada, and we see Peter Volkos next to him, and that's Rudy Audio, the guy that looks very young, like a kid. And next to him, the older guy is Bernard Leach, and the guy to his left is Yanagi. Yanagi wrote a book called The Unknown Craftsman, and if you're a potter, that is necessary reading material. And it talks about the aesthetics, the idea of this kind of peasant pottery, what they embraced. It is work that is very humble. And so it doesn't have what in the West we would call an ego. It doesn't strive to be beyond anything that it is. It is happy in its humbleness and its simplicity and in its function. Those are some people right there that greatly influenced American pottery. That group right there, there are none more influential. This is one of Yanagi's pieces, and it's very similar to the Hamada pieces. This is a traditional vase. It's a squared vase. So this can be made with slabs of clay and constructed. And there are ways of working with a rounded piece and letting it dry a little bit and paddling it into geometric shapes like this and flattening it. But this piece is most likely made with a slab. This is the book by Yanagi, The Unknown Craftsman. I recommend it if you're interested in pottery. This is a piece by Bernard Leach, the older guy there. So he had a pottery, and he's one of the most famous American potters in history. When you first dip a piece in glaze, it takes a little while for the glaze to dry on the surface. And if you take your fingers, and we see 4 fingers here, so when the glaze is still wet, he just takes his fingers and whoosh across the surface like that, and it thins the glaze there. And this glaze has iron in it, and if you have the right reduction, it becomes a beautiful rusty color that contrasts with the black of that Temmaku. It has high iron in it, and if there's enough iron, it'll go black. But where it's thinner or where it breaks on the edge, you get that rusty color there that really gives variety and interest to a beautiful Temmaku. This is the work of Rudy Audio, and he was influenced by the painting movement. And we have a movement in history called the Blue Rider movement. And in that, they painted horses that were blue, and the horse was like a vehicle that took someone on a journey. And in Rudy Audio's pottery, these sculptural forms, they make a reference to the Blue Rider movement. We see figures incorporated with horses. He would work with slabs and coil. So you can stack coils on top of each other and kind of pinch them together and then scrape with a metal rib. And that was his method. These pieces are extremely expensive today, very valuable. Slab construction. Peter Callis built the first traditional Japanese onigama, or wood-burning kiln, in the U.S. in 1976. EKU has an onigama kiln, by the way, that we've fired many times, and there have been a lot of beautiful work come out of that kiln. Artist Peter Volkos' works were created over the course of 7 days, firing and were subject to any effects of the kiln. The Japanese call these effects controlled accidents. So they believed in kind of a spontaneity, and the pieces get painted by the process of firing the kiln. And the amount of wood you put in and the kinds of wood that you put in, even the weather, all of that can contribute to the piece. The piece is going to be different in the front of the kiln, then it's going to be in the back of the kiln. So each piece of pottery that's fired in a wood kiln kind of tells a story. This is a Peter Vokkos piece. The eagle has landed. He was known as an abstract expressionist of clay. He worked with clay the way a painter would work in the abstract expressionist movement. So he would stack clay, and he would rip and tear and gouge, and these are very expressive forms of working with clay. Was very physical, and he would push blocks of clay inside of other blocks. It wasn't about creating a very elegant, refined piece. At one point in his career, he said, I was making pots like everybody else, and I felt like I needed to do something different to kind of stand alone as my work to get, attention. He said, at one point in my life, I decided to go ugly. He went in a different direction from making traditionally beautiful piece of pottery and went very sculptural and went in an expressive way. So the gouging and really shows the quality of the material, the way it will, when you press on it, it can, it can expand, or it'll gouge, or it'll rip and tear. He was really bringing those qualities of clay to the surface and showing all the different characteristics of clay. Notice how it's a little off center there, and we see a lot of torn edges. That is a way of letting the material speak in this process. Here he is before his death, and you can look at the beautiful qualities of the clay, the way it's gouged, and we see flat surfaces, smooth surfaces next to very rough and torn edges. One form pushed into where a hole was carved out, and it is very spontaneous. In this process, I'm sure he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen in this, but kind of it's an improvisation where you're making choices along the way, just getting into the physicality of working and see what happens. It's very experimental in this kind of process. When you fire it in wood, you get all these different tones. When the wood is firing, it brings out the iron out of the clay, and you get the wood ash glaze. And sometimes charcoal builds up, and the carbon from the charcoal can turn it very black. Here's his helper, Peter Kalles, working with him on a piece. Peter Kalles helped him fire his pottery when he was too old to pick up these pieces and move them around and fire them. Peter Kalles was very instrumental in the success of Peter Vokkos. This is another T-bowl, and I talked about the bird's nest of the traditional Shino glazes, and you can see that the artist is not trying to create a really even application of the glaze. It's all the variation, the thick areas where the Shino goes a lighter color, and some very thin areas go that rusty brown. And even the drips can be a way of creating variation and flow in a work on the surface with the Shino glaze. This is what a kiln looks like when you break it down. And in the front, it's like, whoa, that didn't turn out very good. But that front near the firebox is really gnarly. And it looks like pots that were found at the bottom of the sea. It has rough, kind of barnacle-like texture. But when you turn those pieces over, you'll see warm, neutral colors and flash. And so it's that ruggedness, and you don't know what to expect. But when you flip that over and you have one side, it has kind of a barnacle-like finish, and the other side has warm tones, subtlety in it, and that roughness together, it really works. But when you first look at an unbrick kiln, it's a little scary looking, like, oh well. But the more you peel back that first layer of the kiln, that's when you start to get into the most beautiful. It doesn't quite have that barnacle look that the the face of the next to the firebox has. Now we're going to look at some American Indian pottery by Maria Martinez, and her work is fired a totally different way. She is coiling her pots. If you take a real fine particle clay and you wedge it together and you roll out little ropes of clay, you can stack them on top of each other. And then you scrape it and smooth it together. And then she is going to paint it with a liquid clay after she burnishes it. The shiny black, the really rich black area, has been compressed with a stone. If you rub the surface of the clay, it's going to compress that clay and make it very glossy. It polishes it. And after she does that, she paints a liquid clay called a slip over top of that, and it's that matte black. It gets its matte from being fired in a high carbon atmosphere. And I'll show you how she does that. But look at the beautiful patterns on this. Now, these are traditional symbols that represent the spirituality of the American Indians. They're very abstract, but they are symbolic and have a traditional meaning. And so a potter may vary a little bit with their patterns, and it may become individualistic, but it's really telling a spiritual story of abstraction and form in their decoration. Here she is working, and you can see that she's working in a little plaster mold. And that's because at the base of a pot, it cantilevers outward. And that's the hardest part of this coiling process, because as you pinch on that, that clay wants to just collapse when it's wet. So she has a backing to hold it up. And so she is rolling those ropes out, or you can squeeze them and make a rope vertically. You can roll them out on a table, and then you just wrap it around it and bond it. You pull the clay, you close both sides of the clay, and so now we see she's coming in with her coils, which means you lean the coil on the inside of the pot and pinch it inward. You move it inward, and now she is scraping it with a tool to smooth it and shape it. After you get the piece in greenware, you want to fire it. And the Indians traditionally worked outside with an open air kiln or a pit. And so they stack the work on top of each other. You generally want to put the lip downward so it won't cool too quickly. If the lip cools faster than the bottom, it'll cause it to check and it'll crack there. When you fire pottery, you always put it upside down. And you can put fuel sticks in between the pots. It's not going to stick together because they fire without glaze and it's a lower temperature. These are, this is buffalo dung, dried buffalo dung. And when you burn that, it releases carbon, and that carbon goes into the pottery. You can see that they are using old metal plates or trays, or some people use license plates. You can fire in a steel garbage can with the lid. You can get that carbon to go into the pottery from a rich fuel source and very little oxygen. Here she is digging it out. After the firing, you would want to cover that up with ash, old fireplace ash, or dirt, and you seal it with that rich carbon atmosphere, and the clay or the dirt will seal it where oxygen doesn't go back in it. It traps that carbon in there, and it cools down in an oxygen-free atmosphere. So they come out of the pit looking really great and beautiful. She's digging those out of there. Now, not all pottery is fired this way with the buffalo dung. Some of them are painted with engopes or clay-like slips that color it. Traditionally, you'll have a black and a brown, a red, and a white in that decoration. But look how geometric and abstract the shapes are in her design. Usually those shapes will go really well with the overall form. You want the surface to be in harmony with its form. Ancient potters, ancient Egyptians utilized a technique. A flat disc attached to a flywheel is kicked by the potter to make it turn. As the slab of clay turns, the potter pinches clay between their fingers and thumbs to create a round symmetrical shape inside and out. So we have earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. Earthenware is the low temperature, stoneware and porcelain are the higher temperature. But porcelain is white, and we make porcelain through Grauleg, which is mined in England, and they have an EPK, a kaolin in Florida that we use. And so that's Edgar's Plastic Kaolin, EPK. And porcelain has more glass in it. And if you hold a thin piece of porcelain up to the light and let the light shine in it, it is translucent. That whiteness will glow. You can see the light through the porcelain. In the Ming Dynasty, artists painted elaborate designs with distinctive blue and white patterns that became a commodity in Islamic and European cultures. A master of contemporary ceramic sculpture is Wayne Higby. His work references the American landscape. This is a Wayne Higby piece here. I met Wayne Higby at a conference, a ceramic conference. We talked for quite a while. I even talked with him about doing some pottery with him. I got a grant, and I ended up working with Byron Temple, a very famous potter who lived in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I never did get to meet with Wayne Higby, but he's very famous potter. He was teaching at Alfred University in New York for a long time. He got his reputation through doing raku, a low temperature, black and crackle kind of surface. But later in his career, he switched to porcelain, and this is a porcelain piece. And when you look at it, it's very sculptural. If you look at the surface, the longer you look at it, you start to see in that pattern that there is kind of like a river. And once you see that with the water and the ripples of the water, then that makes you think, well, maybe those pieces that are holding up that central part are boulders and rocks. And then the whole thing opens up to you like it's a canyon. Very nice cutting, very spontaneous edges in this work of art by Wayne Higby. Earth Cloud is perhaps the largest porcelain sculpture ever created and spans a two-part panoramic installation between two adjacent buildings. 500 tiles covered in gold leaf are among the porcelain tiles and evoke sunlight as well as mineral veins within the earth. So this is a Wayne Higby piece incorporating tiles. 12,000 hand-cut glazed porcelain tiles, approximately 5,000 square feet connecting two buildings together. The creative process. Ceramics as politics. Julie Green's The Last Supper. Green depicts, when we look at this, it's like, well, there's a bunch of plates on the wall. And what about that title, The Last Supper? Well, what is that about? When you read about this, you come upon the idea that the Last Supper that she's talking about is the last meal that an inmate will eat before they're executed. And so each one of these plates on the wall is documenting the Last Supper that an inmate would eat. So sometimes their last meal would be a pizza with a 6-pack of Dr. Pepper and an ice cream cone, an apple pie. Some inmates that had never had a birthday cake in their life would order a birthday cake. So we see one of the pieces, a pizza and a birthday cake. It documents that Last Supper and an inmate's life. Ceramics as politics. Julie Green's The Last Supper. Each plate is titled by the state of execution and date, leaving out the names of the inmates. Green initially wanted the plates to be institutional looking, but they have become more painterly over the years. Now we're going to look at some glass. When I was in graduate school, I had a chance to work with glass. And you take a large pipe, steel pipe that's hollow, and you dip it into a furnace. If you hold glass at about 2,200 degrees, it will melt into a liquid. And so you take that pipe and you dip it in there and turn it and spin it. And that's called gathering the glass. After you dip it and gather it, you marver it. You roll it back and forth on a table, and that centers it. It's different than clay because your axis is horizontal rather than vertical. And when you hold that pipe with that glass, it's liquid, it wants to slip off by gravity. So you have to keep spinning it, shaping it. You can take a wooden tool or even a real thick layer of wet newspaper, and you can squeeze it there without burning your hands. You'll have some gloves on your hands to keep you from burning it. You don't want that hot glass to touch your skin or it'll stick to it. Blown glass was also used to create stained glass windows in cathedrals. This is a mosaic glass bowl from Rome. You can melt little chips of glass together. So any broken glass that if a piece checks and breaks, you can break it up and incorporate it into your next piece. That's a way that glass artists recycle. Colorants are a little bit expensive, and so you don't want to waste stuff. And in this piece, you can see different broken pieces have been fused together. And when you slump a piece, that means you're pushing a glass piece into a mold. You can push it inside of a mold, or you can drape it over top of a mold, depending on the shape of your form. This is a Roman piece of glass. It's a very nice piece. Stained glass is made by adding metallic salts to glass during manufacture. Pieces were then broken or cut into smaller fragments. Details were painted on, and the structure was supported with an armature of iron bands. Beautiful stained glass in the Church of Saint Denis in France. This is called the Moses window. That pointed arch up there, we call it a Gothic arch. Abbot Suger used stained glass in his design for the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, believing that the writings of Saint Denis called for light as a manifestation of the divine spirit. So that's one of the beautiful things about glass, is it creates translucency and light comes through it. And when you have a church with beautiful stained glass windows, it tells a story. In the past, there were times where the masses couldn't read, so they couldn't even read the Bible. So they got their inspiration and their stories to a large part by the artwork in the church. And these stained glass windows tell the story of the Gospels and the saints and different stories from their tradition. Dale Chihuly co-founded the Pilchuck Glass School and transformed glassblowing to sculptural ends. Chihuly's Millefiori was inspired by both the sea and flowers. So we're going to look at some Dale Chihuly work. Dale Chihuly, he's lost one of his eye, and he wears a pirate patch, and he's an older guy. He'll have a whole group of people. Dale Chihuly works with a team of artists, and it's like a big dance. So you'll have several people. Each one of them has a specific dance that they do in this. There'll be someone with a blowtorch, and when they need to heat up a neck on a piece to keep it as hot as the rest of the piece, someone will dance in there and hit that piece. You'll have people that are gathering, people that will take the work to an oven. It's a concerted dance. Fred Wilson in Drip Drop Plop was an artist that made traditional pieces about the African American experience. The Drip Drop Plop represents tears, representing the painful experience that he experienced in his past. So we're going to look at fiber arts. Fiber arts are traditionally used to fill three-dimensional space, such as carpet within a room or clothing on a body. The unicorn in captivity would have been hung on a castle wall in the Middle Ages to warm the stones. Yes, these big giant textiles were heavy and thick, and you can imagine living in a castle. You needed a little extra insulation on the wall. So not only did they beautify, they also kind of kept echo, they softened the sound in the castle, but mainly they were used for added insulation and for heat. But this is one of the most famous weavings in all history, and it is the capture of the unicorn. A new narrative, Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum. Fred Wilson expose the cultural and political and socioeconomic assumptions that underlie modern museum space. He would go into a museum and he'd go through all of the artifacts in the museum and he'd look for the things that the museum wouldn't really show. It didn't want to show, didn't want to go there. He found things. He reinterpreted their collection. And the Maryland Historical Society went there to present a larger story than the museum was used to telling. So you'll understand what he would go in, and this is an example of a work that he would dig out. This is an inventory of slaves as livestock. So you can look at here and you can look at the price of what that person was worth. So an elderly woman might, be worth $1 or $5. And you can see how they valued people, what value they placed on people, and how they treated them like animals, like livestock. One of the things I think was brilliant about Fred Wilson's work is that he would show the wealth that was created through slavery, and he would often juxtapose how high society lived and the furnishings and the wealth that was juxtaposed to the whipping post that's on the left. Now, these were things that generally weren't showed and curated into a museum show. A new narrative, Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum, iron slave shackles, and a whipping post are featured objects. He was struck by the fact that there were no marble busts of famous black Marylanders, yet many white men who did not have particular impact on Maryland history. He shows this beautiful silver work, something for a very wealthy home. He contrasts that by showing the shackles that a slave would have to wear. Elegant and brutally functional, juxtaposed together there. Fiber. All fiber art trace their origins to weaving, interlacing horizontal and vertical threads. A tapestry is a weaving in which weft yarns are several colors. So I'll go over that. My wife is a weaver, and we have a loom. Our loom's right over there, and it's just like this one right here. And so I've helped her tie on many times. You tie on these, the preliminary strings are called your warp. And you can see there's a bar with strings on it in the front of that. That's where you tie your warp on. And you crank it down. You have to go through this screen here called the heddles. They're like an eye of a needle, and you thread that to each individual string through the heddles. Now, it's kind of like an organ where you have pedals at the bottom, and when you press on this pedal, it raises up a harness that has the heddles in it. And so you can change foot pattern, and it's lifting up other heddles. As you put threads back and forth with your weft, it'll create different patterns. If you do a 1, 3, 4 pedal combination or what have you, that's a way of getting different geometric threads. You can run different colors with your weft through there and create colorful patterns in your weaving. It seems that there's not as many weavers as there used to be. It's a hard way to make a living. And now they have big machines that are automatic that, can produce this kind of thing very quickly. As Churchill Weavers, a local Berea, very famous weaving operation, they had hand looms upstairs where the tourists would come in and see the hand looms being operated. But in the basement, they had giant machines that were weaving automatically, and that could make them competitive on a national market. This is an example of Kiki Smith's, and she has collaborated with computerized weaving here. So we see this tapestry called The Guide. At first, tapestries were hand done, and so you would kind of hand stitch across a work. Or you could weave kind of a blank pattern and then hand stitch inside of it, kind of embroider like. There are a lot of different techniques in weaving. Embroidery involves designs made by needlework. The town of Champa in India was known for its rumals. Rumals are embroidered muslin textiles used for wrapping gifts. The composition is consistent. A floral border encloses a series of images. The scene shown is one of a wedding. So this is a rumal, and it's an example of embroidering. When they gave a gift to someone, instead of wrapping paper, they would use this as a wrapping. It's very decorative. And then, you don't throw it away. You save that, and it's a gift. Annie Albers is one of the most famous. We study her as one of the great weavers. This is an example of her work. So her work is very geometric, and she talks about the geometry of life. While this doesn't have a consistent pattern to it, it is very geometric, and we see the repetition of the stripes in this work. But it's kind of hard to place where this pattern is coming from and what it's about. This is called a hand loom, and they would tie it on. You could tie it onto a wall or a tree or what have you, and you sit down on the pillow and you weave it back and forth. Instead of having the loom do that, they have hand tools that they separate the different threads with so they can create pattern. And so that is the warp that you're looking at. And as they shuttle a string that's wrapped around a wooden block, they're shuttling weft in there. And each time you put the weft through, you want to switch the threads so the thread is interlocked together. And it's that grid of interlocking fibers that keeps the weaving from unraveling. Faith Ringgold painted on soft fabric with quilted borders made by her mother until her mother's death in 1981. So this is a quilt called Tar Beach, and it's about an African-American family and the dreams of their young girls. Her father worked on that bridge behind her, but they would go up on the roof in the summertime to get out of the heat, without any air conditioning. And they'd have their meal up there. And she would often lay on the quilt with her sister and look up at the stars. And if you look just above the bridge there, it's her spirit flying through the sky there. And we see the family is gathered together with a meal. So this quilt is a narrative about her experiences and the traditions of her family. This is kind of an unappealing weaving called black lung. And if you remember, during the coal mines, many workers breathed in the dust of the coal, and it would embed into the tiny air of the lung there and just kind of fill up, and it eventually would cause cancer. And so this is a nightmare. It represents the black lungs, and hospital gown could be implied here as trying to recover from this black dust that has settled in the lungs. Abacanovitz used traditional fiber materials such as burlap and string to create forms based on human anatomy. The repetition of form draws attention to the human condition. Textile wrappings remind us of clothing, but also of bandages. So I heard her talk about how the people were kind of unfinished, like humans are. We're still evolving, we're still developing. So these figures are kind of rough and unfinished. There's imperfections in them. This is burlap dipped in resin and placed into a mold. The other side is kind of open, but there's no head there. But it is sometimes the human condition. Sometimes it lives through periods of inequality and terrible treatment. So I think all that is kind of built into this sculpture. Artist Yinka Shonibare was raised in Nigeria before going to school in London. He makes hybrid clothes with West African fabrics. So this is a hybrid of tradition of Nigeria and London. And he's kind of mixing the styles in this. Very contemporary trends with African pattern, African colors. And it's about, being born in Africa, but raised in a London culture. And so he's kind of mixing those styles and creating a hybrid through his individually made clothing. This piece is called Contamination, and it's kind of eerie. It's about the spreading of a virus, and each time that it's displayed, they add new elements to it. So it's an example of how artists working in fabric and textiles have sought to transcend this limitation of craft and try to make works that are at the level of fine art and transcend the medium. And obviously, this is not functional, so it's purely aesthetic. Metal has been used for art, tools, vessels, and weapons alike. Gold is the easiest to work with as it is relatively soft. The representation of Tutankhamun is an example of gold repoussé. So repoussé is when you work with a soft metal like gold or copper, it's soft enough that you can hammer in behind it. And if you lay something soft down on the front of it and hammer from the back, you can sculpt with it. The Statue of Liberty is actually an example of repoussé, and the copper plates in the Statue of Liberty are about the thickness of a penny, maybe a penny and a half. So you can heat it up with torches and then hammer it. And they hammered it into wooden molds to create its shape. So after you shape it through repoussé, you can emboss over top of it. So this is an example of Tutankhamun hunting ostriches from his chariot. What a spectacular piece that is. Metals were increasingly used in jewelry, as seen in the Persian griffin bracelet. So Persia is now Iran. The Oxus treasure from which it was discovered was stolen from the Muslim merchants by bandits who sought to melt it down. Captain F.C. Burton rescued the treasure and donated the griffin bracelet to a museum in London. So here we have the mythological, fictional griffin birds that are made into a bracelet opposing griffins. This is an interesting salt and pepper shaker by Cellini. This is Neptune, and the female represents the earth, and Neptune represents the sea, and the sea is salt water, right? So that's where you get the idea of Neptune being the salt shaker, and the earth is the pepper shaker. And there's a beautiful ornamentation that has images about the cycles of the seasons and on the lower part of it. But that's probably the most expensive salt and pepper shaker you'll ever see. And that was sculpted in 1540, just about the time of the Renaissance. Chris Burden collected cast iron street lamps made in the 1920s and 30s. He resurfaced them and painted them with a uniform gray, and he installed them in tight rows with proper wiring. Urban light was eventually installed in front of the Los Angeles Museum of Art with 202 lamps in its final form. So, man, what a beautiful work there. It reminds me of a Greek temple with columns. So if you look at the format or the form that all these lights together make, it looks like a Greek temple. And so I think of this as a temple of light. It's titled Urban Lights, made from recycled old street lamps. What a great idea. Now we're going to look finally at wood, and we're going to look at some artifacts that have survived from ancient cultures. Cedar is a favored wood for Native American artists of the Northwest coast. One of the things that they love the smell of burning cedar. It has a beautiful fragrance. But if you've ever burned firewood, you'll notice that the cedar is more of a talking wood. It snaps and pops and crackles. You're sitting around the fire, it creates more sound. It's almost like it was a talking fire to them, and they would sit around the fire and have ceremonies around the fire. It's one of the favored Indian woods to work with. This is a clan chest. It would hold clan regalia, like outfits and traditional costumes, clothing, coats, that sort of thing. A cedar keeps bugs away from it, but it's just a beautiful wooden chest. And look at the patterns on that. Look at the abstraction. Abstraction seeks to get to the essence of something. And so you see all these eyes looking out at you. Eyes kind of reflect our ability to see. The eyes are the seat of the soul, I think, is a consciousness. And so you have all this abstract, very highly spiritual symbolism in this Indian chest. Wood has been the preferred material for making furniture. The chest was made by Thomas Dennis. William Searle shows panels carved in a popular style with symmetry of design. Its design is rich and elaborate in its celebration of the natural world founded in the United States in the 1660s. An American chest, and we see the similarities there. Still, we see a reverence for nature and the cycles. We see the leaves. Look how flowing they are. They look like everything looks like it's in movement. And that top ribbon border across the top of that, it is reminiscent of a Mobius strip that's a symbol for the cycles of nature and for infinity, where the inside becomes the outside becomes the inside. Like a twill, if you took something and twisted it like that, it would wrap around itself. And you see that kind of symbol along the top of it, intricately carved in red oak, a beautiful American furniture representation. And this is the last work that we're going to look at. This is crochet. We don't normally think of crochet as a fine art form, but this artist has taken it to a new level. The coral reef was founded by the Wertheim sisters in order to draw attention to dying coral reefs. The coral reefs are in terrible shape right now. So sometimes art is a way of communicating something needs to be done about this. In its structure, the crochet models hyperbolic, geometric, high mathematics. How is society affected by the analogy between women's work and this high art? So traditionally, people look down. It's only women's work, you know. So here we have women's work that is a high art, and it's an incredible piece, isn't it? So it really does look like a coral reef that's crochet, very precise and mathematical. And I want to end with an image of what a coral reef looks like when it dies out. So all those beautiful colors disappear. And when your coral reefs die, it puts the entire ocean at risk. And, you know, life is so interconnected that, you know, when one thing goes out, it's going to affect the whole of life.